I guess the most direct question is the president right? Would you have won if you had embraced him more closely?
Actually, I don't think so. Our district is very politically divided, and since I was elected and the president was elected in 2016, the Democratic base has been truly energized, and we saw this throughout the last 2 years. So I've handled the issue of supportive of the president on this way. I've said I'll support him when I agree with him, and most of the time I did agree with him on policies, and will not support him when I disagree with him, and that's clearly the case, and I think that's what my constituents expected me to do.
So what lessons do you think we should take, all of us, and particularly Republicans, from this midterm election, and particularly for people like you who come from blue states, who come from districts that might be more divided, they're not Trump base, as it were. What is the route for those people to get to Congress, to get to the Senate, given President Trump's leadership?
Well, I think you have to carve out your own identity, and you certainly have to have a clear, consistent philosophy that will appeal to swing voters and voters in blue states like New York. I think it's clear the president supported candidates in Indiana, Tennessee, North Dakota, for instance, and they did very well. But that is not the environment that those of us who run in New York or California or New Jersey, for instance, face. So I think we have to recognize the Republican Party needs to be a big tent, and we have to be accommodating to the local concerns and local interests that exist in those states, especially if you want to win. We can't just be a party that is closeted into certain narrow confines, either ideologically or politically, around the country. That's a prescription for losing.
President Trump doesn't come across usually as a big tent kind of guy, if I can say that. He seems to be more somebody who excludes rather than includes. Is he really controlling? Is he leading the Republican Party at this point? When he first was elected, people said, not really, he's not even really quite a Republican. He was a Democrat for many years. But is he really solidifying his support within the Republican Party?
Well, I think there's no doubt the president has strong support in the Republican Party, and I've been pleased to support him on regulatory changes, on things like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, on ending the Iran deal, on standing up for the country to get our NATO allies to finally bear their share of defense costs in NATO. I'm all for the president. The president did a great job on renegotiating the NAFTA agreement that's helping our upstate dairy farmers. So there are many areas where I'm in agreement with the president. And I think that what we have to do is recognize that the tone sometimes is going to turn off some voters. And if we're going to win in 2020, we've got to address that.
So give some advice to people who are left behind in Congress after you leave. You've been there. You've been part of the decision-making, part of the legislating. What would you advise your fellow Republicans in the House in terms of working with Democrats? Are there some areas that you could see people coming together and moving legislation forward that the president would sign?
I do think so. I think that I was a member of the Problem Solvers group. It's a bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans in the House. We set forth some constructive approaches on how to fix the mess that's the Affordable Care Act and try to address some of the issues of premiums and deductibles being way too high. I think that's one area, and I also think infrastructure still remains an area where you can find some common ground with Democrats and Republicans. It's pretty clear the Democrats are going to come in. I expect they'll overreach. Their progressive left base in the party wants things that, frankly, are not going to be good for the country, single-payer system, for instance. So I think we have to find areas where we can come together as Democrats and Republicans and agree it's not going to be my problem next year.
It won't be your problem, but you have the wisdom maybe we could help people. And looking backwards, do you think the Republicans maybe overreached when it came to repealing the Affordable Care Act? That was a big issue. You took a couple of runs at it, and it really put it on the agenda in a way that I think may have made some voters across the country concerned about their health care.
Well, I think we clearly didn't sell the plan to people in an effective fashion. And because of our Freedom Caucus in the House, we wound up reopening this argument over pre-existing conditions, which should never have been opened. In fact, our bill, I believe, protected everyone with pre-existing conditions, but the Democrats made it an effective issue to try to exploit that weakness that we had. And that was done, frankly, to try to appease the right wing in the Republican Party in the House, the so-called Freedom Caucus, to get their votes to pass that bill. And candidly, many of them didn't even vote for the bill. So I think that my recommendation is that people in our conference have to recognize that not everyone is coming from a district in Alabama or Texas or Utah, and we've got to have a set of policies that you can sell broadly in the country, especially if you want to win in places like New York and California and New Jersey, et cetera.
So finally, you have sort of a very special position right now because you are a politician. You know how to win votes. You know how to win elections. At the same time, you don't have to worry about the next election right now. You don't have to worry about that. So as someone who knows that process well, address something that never gets addressed, which is the debt and the deficit, the annual budget deficit as well as the total debt. What could be done by Congress, Republicans, Democrats alike, to try to address this problem that I think everyone agrees is really going to crush us, or at least our children and our grandchildren?
Well, within the limits of the time we have, let's face it, 28% of federal spending is defense and all other domestic spending. 72% of federal spending is Medicare, Medicaid, and Medicare, and interest on the debt. Guess which portion, the 28% portion or the 72% portion, is growing much faster? It's the 72% portion, and that's because of demographic trends in the country. So I think the first thing we have to do is be frank and honest with the public as to the fiscal situation we face, as to what is driving the costs that we face, and it's that 72% of the spending, because we are an aging society, and demographic trends have nothing to do with whether you're a Democrat or Republican, a liberal or conservative. So we've got to speak frankly to the American people about what's truly driving our debt and deficits, because a sovereign wealth crisis, if we can't pay our bills or suddenly we can't market our debt, is going to be a real downer for the American economy, and it's going to hurt the most the poor and the middle class.